At 25,000 feet over Steinhude Lake, Germany, on October 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Charles Elwood Yeager spotted them first. 22 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters crossed in front of his squadron from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock, flying at the same altitude approximately 1.5 miles away. The yellow-nosed cowlings caught the morning sun for a fraction of a second before the formation disappeared into the haze over the German countryside. Most pilots would not have seen them at that distance. Most pilots had 20/20 vision. Yeager's vision had been tested at 20/10, which meant he could see details at twice the distance of a normal person. It was not training. It was not experience. It was genetics. And on October 12, 1944, it was the advantage that started everything. Yeager was 21 years old. He was sitting in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang named Glamorous Glenn II, a machine he had flown for 3 months and trusted completely. The name was painted in flowing script on the nose. Glamorous Glenn. Not Glamorous Glenn III, not Glamorous Glenn I. The second, because the first Glamorous Glenn had been shot out from under him 7 months earlier over occupied France, and Yeager had spent the next 8 weeks hiding from German patrols while the French resistance smuggled him across the Pyrenees into Spain. He was leading the 357th Fighter Group on a bomber escort mission to Bremen. 60 B-24. Liberator heavy bombers were hitting industrial targets in northern Germany. Yeager's job was to keep German fighters away from those bombers. The mission was routine. Escort to target, provide top cover during the bombing run, escort back to England. He had flown this profile 27 times since returning to combat in August. 27 missions without significant contact with enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe was being careful by late 1944. They had bled out too many pilots. The men still flying were experienced, methodical, and selective about which fights they took. But 22 Messerschmitts meant the Germans were committed to stopping this bomber formation. 22 aircraft was not a patrol. It was not harassment. It was a coordinated intercept by pilots who intended to get through the American fighter screen and destroy the bombers. Yeager keyed his radio. His voice was calm, factual, the tone of a man reading a grocery list. Cement leader to cement squadron. 22 bandits, 11 o'clock level, Angels 25, 1.5 miles, preparing to engage. He checked his position relative to the sun. The blinding disk of the October sun was at his back. Perfect. He was coming out of the east with the sun behind him. The oldest trick in aerial combat, taught by the Red Baron in the First World War, and still valid 26 years later. Always attack from the sun. Make the enemy look into the light to see you coming. He dropped in behind the German formation and followed for 3 minutes. His squadron followed in formation behind him, 16 P-51 Mustangs stalking 22 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The tactical situation was acceptable, but not overwhelming. The Americans had surprise and position. The Germans had numbers. Yeager climbed from 25,000 feet to 30,000 feet, closing the distance from 1.5 miles to 1,000 yards. He still had his external wing tanks attached, the teardrop-shaped fuel containers mounted under each wing that gave the Mustang its incredible range. The tanks created drag and reduced maneuverability, but jettisoning them meant losing the fuel inside. Every gallon was calculated. Drop the tanks too early and you might not have enough fuel to reach England. Drop them too late, and you lose the dogfight because your aircraft handles like a truck. Yeager held onto his tanks. He was closing to firing range when everything changed. I spent 6 hours writing, editing, and posting this video. If this story matters to you, the only thing I ask is that you hit the subscribe button. Just subscribe. That's all. Thank you. The regulation that almost ended Yeager's combat career was simple and ironclad. Any pilot who had evaded capture in occupied territory could not fly combat missions again. The logic was brutal, but undeniable. If that pilot was shot down a second time and captured, the Germans would interrogate him. They would extract information about every partisan, every safe house, every escape route that had been used. They would roll up the entire resistance network. The regulation existed to protect the French civilians who risked their lives saving American airmen. Yeager understood the logic. He disagreed with the conclusion. 7 months earlier, on March 5, 1944, Yeager had been flying his 8th combat mission. He was escorting B-24 bombers to Bordeaux, France, flying the original glamorous Glenn, a P-51 Mustang with his girlfriend's name painted on the fuselage, Glennis Dickhouse, a woman he had met during flight training in California, a woman who was waiting for him to come home. 3 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters jumped his flight from behind. Yeager saw them late, turned to engage, and made a decision that almost killed him. He attempted a head-on pass against 3 aircraft simultaneously. It was aggressive to the point of recklessness, the kind of maneuver that worked in training but got pilots killed in combat. 20mm cannon fire from the lead FW-190 hit his Mustang at 18,000 feet. The shells severed his elevator cables. The Mustang snap-rolled violently, thrown into an uncontrolled spin by the loss of elevator authority. Yeager fought the controls for 3 seconds before accepting that the aircraft was dead. He released his harness, pushed himself out of the cockpit, and fell free into the cold air over occupied France. He waited to pull the ripcord. German fighters often circled overhead after shooting down an American aircraft, watching for parachutes, then diving to strafe the descending pilot. Yeager tumbled through the air, his body spinning wildly, fighting the instinct to deploy the parachute immediately. He waited until 8,000 feet before pulling the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that nearly knocked him unconscious. He looked up to see the 3 FW-190s circling overhead, but they did not dive. They watched him descend, then turned east and disappeared. He landed in a forest 50 miles east of Bordeaux. The parachute caught in tree branches and left him hanging 15 feet above the ground. He cut himself down using his survival knife, landed hard on frozen earth that jarred his teeth, and looked around. German voices in the distance. Wehrmacht patrols searching the area. He had perhaps 30 minutes before they found him. Yeager rolled up his parachute, stuffed it into a hollow tree, and ran. He moved through the forest without a clear destination, simply putting distance between himself and the crash site. His right hand was bleeding where cannon shell fragments had cut through his glove. His shoulder ached from the parachute opening shock. His ears were ringing from the sudden pressure changes of the descent. But he was alive and free, and those 2 facts were the only things that mattered. He found a thick stand of brush and burrowed into it, pulling his flight jacket around him as the temperature dropped. Night came early in March. The temperature fell below freezing. He ate a chocolate bar from his survival kit, drank water from his canteen, and tried to sleep under a pile of dead leaves. The next morning, a French woodcutter found him. The man appeared out of the forest like a ghost, moving silently through the trees with an axe over his shoulder. He saw Yeager huddled in the brush, stopped, looked around carefully, and then whispered a single word. Boche. Germans. The woodcutter gestured for Yeager to stay hidden, then disappeared back into the forest. Yeager waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. German voices echoed through the forest, soldiers calling to each other as they searched. Yeager stayed motionless in the brush, barely breathing, listening to Wehrmacht boots crunching on frozen leaves less than 100 yards away. The woodcutter returned at dusk with 2 younger men. They spoke no English. Yeager spoke no French. But their intentions were clear. They led him through the forest to a farmhouse, moving only on paths hidden from the road. The farm family fed him bread and cheese, gave him civilian clothes that smelled of tobacco and wood smoke, and hid him in a barn while German patrols searched the countryside. For the next 8 weeks, the French resistance moved Yeager from safe house to safe house across occupied France. He slept in barns where he could hear German soldiers questioning farmers 20 feet away. He hid in root cellars while Wehrmacht patrols searched the houses above him. He traveled at night on back roads, always moving west toward the Spanish border, always 1 step ahead of the Germans who were systematically sweeping the region for Allied airmen. The Maquis, the armed French resistance fighters, adopted him into their group. They gave him false identity papers that identified him as a French laborer. They taught him basic French phrases. They fed him what they had, which was never enough. Bread, cheese, wine that tasted like vinegar, vegetables from gardens they raided at night. Yeager repaid them by teaching them to construct bombs. His father had worked in the West Virginia natural gas fields, and Yeager had watched him handle blasting caps and explosives since childhood. The skills translated perfectly to resistance work. The Maquis needed to destroy railroad bridges, cut communication lines, blow up fuel depots. Yeager showed them how to set charges, calculate timing, and create maximum damage with minimum explosives. He worked alongside them, crawling through mud to place charges under railway tracks, his hands shaking from cold and fear, and the knowledge that one mistake would kill everyone. He learned to move silently through the darkness. He learned to wait motionless for hours while German patrols passed within arm's reach. He learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function while terrified. In late March, when the snow in the Pyrenees began melting, the Maquis prepared to move him across the mountains into Spain. The crossing was the most dangerous part of the escape route. German border patrols watched the passes. Spanish border guards arrested anyone crossing illegally. The mountains themselves killed more evaders than the Germans ever captured. Altitude sickness, exposure, avalanches, falls from cliffs hidden by fog. A guide led Yeager and a wounded B-24 navigator named Omar Patterson across the Pyrenees. Patterson had a badly injured leg from bailing out of his bomber. He could barely walk on flat ground. Climbing through snow-covered mountains in freezing temperatures was agony, but staying in France meant eventual capture. The Germans were closing in. The crossing took 4 days. The snow was knee-deep in the valleys, waist-deep in the passes. The temperature at night dropped well below zero. They had no tent, no sleeping bags, no shelter, except what they could construct from pine branches and parachute fabric. Yeager carried Patterson on his back when the navigator's injured leg gave out. He weighed 155 pounds. Patterson weighed 170. Yeager carried him for 6 miles through snow before finding a place to rest. On the 3rd night, they found an abandoned shepherd's cabin and decided to stop. Patterson hung his wet socks on a bush outside to dry. Both men were exhausted enough to make that mistake. Wet socks on a bush were a signal that someone was hiding inside. German border patrols looked for exactly that kind of mistake. Yeager woke to the sound of bullets punching through the cabin walls. He grabbed Patterson, threw him out a back window, and jumped after him. They landed in deep snow and rolled down a steep hillside, bullets kicking up snow around them. At the bottom of the hill, they found a log slide used by shepherds to move timber down the mountain. Yeager and Patterson threw themselves onto it and rode the slide down 3,000 feet of vertical drop in under 2 minutes. They crashed into a frozen creek at the bottom, bruised and bleeding but alive. The guide found them an hour later, checked them for injuries, and kept moving. They crossed into Spain on March 30th, 1944. Yeager sat in the American consul's office in Madrid on April 2nd, drinking real coffee for the first time in 4 weeks, and learned that his combat flying was over. The regulation was clear. Evaders could not return to combat. The risk to the resistance networks was too great. Yeager was ordered to return to England and then be sent back to the United States for stateside duty. He refused to accept it. Yeager and another evader, First Lieutenant Fred Glover, requested a meeting with the Supreme Allied Commander. It took weeks to arrange. Junior officers did not simply walk into Eisenhower's office and demand policy changes, but Yeager had a case to make, and he made it through official channels until someone in the chain of command decided the request was unusual enough to forward to the top. On June 12, 1944, 6 days after the D-Day invasion, Yeager and Glover stood in General Dwight Eisenhower's office in London. The Supreme Allied Commander sat behind a desk covered with maps of France showing the progress of the Normandy invasion. He looked at the 2 pilots and asked them a simple question: why should he change the regulation? Yeager answered with the logic of a mechanic explaining a broken engine. The regulation existed to protect the French resistance, but the D-Day invasion had just put Allied armies in France. The Germans were being pushed back. The resistance networks in occupied France were less vulnerable than they had been a month earlier. And even if Yeager was shot down and captured again, he had been in Spain for 6 weeks. The Germans already knew the escape routes were through the Pyrenees. They already knew the Maquis operated in the region. Yeager's capture would not reveal anything the Germans did not already know. Eisenhower listened. He asked questions. He reviewed the regulation. Then he made a decision that would later be described in Stars and Stripes newspaper as a gamble. He authorized both men to return to combat with one explicit condition. If either was shot down again, they would be immediately extracted from the combat zone before capture was possible. No heroics, no attempted returns to friendly lines, immediate evacuation. Yeager returned to England on May 15, 1944. He returned to flying combat missions in August. He was assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, 357th Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs out of Leiston Field. He named his new aircraft Glamorous Glenn II. By October 12th, he had flown 27 missions since his return. He had scored 2 confirmed victories, both Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. He was careful, methodical, and experienced. He had learned from being shot down. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not chase fleeing aircraft into situations where he might be separated from his squadron. He flew with the calculated patience of a man who understood that survival in aerial combat was mathematics, not heroism. And then he saw 22 Messerschmitts over Steinhuder Lake, and mathematics became irrelevant. Yeager positioned Glamorous Glenn II at 1,000 yards behind the German formation. His squadron was in position behind him. 16 Mustangs against 22 Messerschmitts. He was closing to firing range, his gun sight reticle settling on the trailing Bf 109, when the geometry of the dogfight changed in a way nobody could have predicted. The German pilot saw him. At 1,000 yards, most pilots would never notice a threat, but this pilot had survived long enough to develop instincts. He saw the Mustang closing from his 6 o'clock, coming out of the sun. He reacted immediately. He broke left in a violent, evasive turn. He turned directly into his wingman. The 2 Messerschmitts collided at approximately 300 miles per hour. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Metal crumpled, wings folded. Both aircraft tumbled toward the ground in a spinning mass of aluminum and steel. Both pilots bailed out immediately, their parachutes blossoming white against the green German countryside 29,000 feet below. Yeager had just scored 2 victories without firing his guns. The sky erupted. The remaining German fighters scattered in all directions. The carefully organized formation fractured into individual aircraft, turning, diving, climbing in pure survival mode. External wing tanks tumbled away as pilots jettisoned the drag-inducing fuel containers to gain maneuverability. The air filled with aircraft spinning and diving in a dogfight that covered 10 miles of German airspace. Yeager jettisoned his own wing tanks and dove into the fight. He saw a Bf 109 turning hard left, trying to get behind a Mustang. Yeager rolled right, pulled lead, and fired a 2-second burst from 600 yards. His 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, mounted 3 in each wing, converged at 600 yards. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they put approximately 100 rounds per second into a space the size of a dinner table. The Messerschmitt exploded. The fuel tank detonated in an orange fireball that sent fragments of aircraft spinning away in all directions. There was no parachute. The pilot had no time to react. 3rd victory. Yeager turned and saw another Messerschmitt angling in behind him. The German pilot had a firing solution developing. In 3 seconds, his 30mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns would be aligned to pour fire into Glamorous Glenn's tail. Yeager had 3 seconds to break the geometry. He pulled the throttle back. Hard. In a dogfight, speed is life. Speed is stored energy that can be converted into altitude or maneuverability. Deliberately reducing speed violates every principle of aerial combat. It is suicide, unless the pursuing pilot is expecting you to do anything except the one thing you should never do. The Merlin engine's roar dropped to a lower pitch. The Mustang's airspeed bled off rapidly. The Messerschmitt, traveling 50 miles per hour faster, overshot. The German pilot sailed past Yeager's position, his nose pointed at empty sky, his firing solution destroyed. Yeager rolled inverted, pulled through and came out behind and under the Messerschmitt at less than 50 feet. He kicked right rudder to align his nose and fired. At 50 feet, accuracy was not a variable. Every round hit. The Messerschmitt split open from nose to tail, hydraulic fluid and fuel spraying from the ruptured fuselage. The fighter rolled inverted and fell. Fourth victory. Yeager looked for another target. His peripheral vision caught a Messerschmitt diving steeply, running for lower altitude. Yeager rolled and followed. The two fighters dropped through 20,000 feet in a descending spiral. The German pilot pulled up at 1,000 feet. Yeager stayed behind him, his gun sight tracking perfectly. He fired a 1-second burst. Bullets raked the Messerschmitt's wings and fuselage. The fighter shuddered, nosed over, and went straight into the German countryside at 400 miles per hour. Fifth victory. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes. Yeager checked his instruments. Fuel was acceptable. Ammunition count showed 587 rounds expended. He had started with 1,800 rounds. The Merlin engine was running smoothly. All gauges showed normal. He reformed with his squadron and continued escorting the bombers to Bremen. The mission was not complete. His job was not to rack up kills. His job was to protect the bombers. The bombers completed their run, turned west toward England. The Mustangs escorted them home. Yeager landed at Leiston Airfield at 11:45 a.m. The ground crew chief climbed up on the wing and looked into the cockpit. He noticed the ammunition counters. He came back down with an expression that mixed professional admiration with something close to disbelief. "Captain," the crew chief said, "you expended 587 rounds." "Yes," Yeager said, "and you got 5. "Yes." The crew chief shook his head slowly. 5 victories on 587 rounds meant Yeager had averaged 117 rounds per kill. Most pilots expended 300 rounds to destroy a single aircraft. Yeager had just demolished 5 German fighters, using less ammunition than most pilots used to damage one. The intelligence officers wanted every detail: altitude, heading, airspeed, enemy aircraft markings, weapons observed, sequence of maneuvers. The debrief lasted 90 minutes. Yeager walked them through the engagement with the flat, methodical precision of a mechanic describing an engine rebuild. No drama, no embellishment, just the sequence of events. The lead intelligence officer, a major who had never flown combat, kept returning to the first 2 kills. "Lieutenant Yeager, you're claiming 2 destroyed aircraft without firing your weapons." "Yes, sir." "How can you confirm they were destroyed?" Yeager looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. Both aircraft collided at approximately 300 miles per hour at 29,000 feet. Both broke apart on impact. Both pilots bailed out. I observed both parachutes deploying. Multiple witnesses from my squadron observed the collision and the bailouts. The aircraft fell approximately 5.5 miles and impacted the ground. I would say that constitutes destroyed. The major made a note. And the other 3? Third aircraft exploded after taking fire from 600 yards. Fuel tank detonation. No parachute observed. Fourth aircraft was engaged at close range, less than 50 feet. Aircraft split open along the fuselage and fell out of control. No parachute observed. Fifth aircraft was hit during a diving engagement and impacted the ground at high speed. No parachute observed. Ammunition expended. 587 rounds total across all 6 guns. The major stopped writing and looked up. 587 rounds for 5 aircraft. "Yes, sir." The room went quiet. Every pilot in the squadron knew the numbers. The average pilot expended between 250 and 300 rounds to destroy a single enemy aircraft. Yeager had just used less than 600 rounds to destroy 5. The arithmetic was disturbing. It suggested either exceptional gunnery or fabrication. The intelligence officers knew Yeager's record. They knew he did not fabricate. The major marked all 5 kills as confirmed. Yeager's total now stood at 7. By the standards of late 1944, that made him a double ace. The 357th Fighter Group had just gained its first pilot to achieve ace-in-a-day status. And General Eisenhower's decision to allow evaders back into combat had just been vindicated in the most public way possible. The story reached Stars and Stripes within 48 hours. The military newspaper, distributed to American forces throughout Europe, ran the headline on October 18, 1944. Flyer Bags 5, Nazi Planes to Vindicate Ike's Ruling. The article described how First Lieutenant Charles Yeager, shot down over France in March, and evaded for 8 weeks with help from the French resistance, had returned to combat against regulations and just destroyed 5 German fighters in a single mission. The newspaper called it Vindication. Yeager called it doing his job. But the timing was perfect for public relations. The Supreme Allied Commander had bent the rules for 2 pilots. One of those pilots had just become an ace in a day. The decision looked brilliant in retrospect. Yeager was promoted to captain within 2 weeks. The promotion was based on his performance, not the publicity. But the publicity did not hurt. The 357th Fighter Group needed heroes. The air war over Germany was grinding, bloody, and increasingly dangerous as the Luftwaffe committed its remaining experienced pilots to defending the Reich. Every American victory mattered. Every American pilot who became an ace was proof that the Allies were winning the war of attrition. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is how Chuck Yeager became one of the first Allied pilots to shoot down a German Me-262 jet fighter, how he scored 4 more victories in a single day 1 month later, how he broke the sound barrier 3 years after the war with 2 cracked ribs and a broomstick, and how his combat record proved that sometimes the best decisions are made by the men on the ground, not by the regulations written thousands of miles away. This is the only channel showing you the real stories behind the legends. Do not miss this. On November 6, 1944, Yeager was leading a flight near Assen, Germany, when his squadron encountered something new. German Me-262 jet fighters. The jets were faster than anything the Allies had in the air. The Messerschmitt Me-262 could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, more than 150 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. In level flight, the jet could simply accelerate away from any pursuit. American pilots had been briefed on the jets. The guidance was simple and frustrating. If you see them, report their position. Do not attempt to engage unless you have an overwhelming tactical advantage. Yeager saw several Me-262s diving toward a formation of American bombers. The jets attacked with 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-24 with a single burst, then used their superior speed to climb away before the escort fighters could react. It was a perfect tactic: hit and run. The Mustangs could not catch them in a chase, but Yeager noticed something. The jets always returned to the same airfield, and when they returned, they were vulnerable. Aircraft preparing to land have their landing gear extended, their flaps deployed, their airspeed reduced to just above stall speed. A jet fighter preparing to land is no faster than a propeller-driven fighter. It is simply an airplane trying not to crash. Yeager dropped below the cloud cover and waited. 20 minutes later, a lone Me-262 appeared on final approach to the enemy airfield, its landing gear extended, its pilot focused on the runway ahead. Yeager dove. The anti-aircraft guns around the airfield opened fire immediately. Heavy flak filled the air around Glamorous Glenn III, Yeager's newest aircraft. The previous Glamorous Glenn had been shot down 6 days earlier, not by enemy fighters, but by bad weather. The pilot flying it, Second Lieutenant Horace Roycroft, had been killed when the aircraft crashed in a storm. Yeager had named his new P-51 Glamorous Glenn III and painted Glennis's name on the fuselage in the same flowing script. He ignored the flak and focused on the jet. Range 800 yards, closing. The Me-262 pilot saw him at the last moment and tried to abort the landing. Too late. The jet's engines spooled up, but acceleration takes time. Yeager fired a 3-second burst. Bullets struck the jet's wings and fuselage. The Me-262 pitched down sharply, hit the ground several hundred feet short of the runway, and exploded in a wooded area. Yeager pulled up hard and flew down the runway at low altitude, weaving between the flak bursts. Anti-aircraft guns on both sides of the runway fired at him. Many of their shells missed him and hit guns on the opposite side of the airfield. He climbed away at full throttle and rejoined his squadron. The kill was confirmed. Yeager became one of the first Allied pilots to destroy a German jet fighter in air-to-air combat. The achievement earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross, but more importantly, it proved a tactical principle. The Me-262 was faster, but speed was irrelevant when the aircraft was landing. Other American pilots began hunting jets on final approach. The tactic became doctrine. 3 weeks later, on November 27, 1944, Yeager had what he would later describe as a fighter pilot's dream. Perfect weather, clear visibility, and a sky full of targets. His flight encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters escorting German bombers. The ensuing dogfight scattered across 30 miles of German airspace. Yeager destroyed 4 FW-190s in the engagement. The first fell after a deflection shot from 400 yards. The second exploded when Yeager fired into its belly from directly underneath at less than 100 feet. The third was caught in a climbing turn and disintegrated under sustained fire. The fourth attempted to escape by diving for the deck and was destroyed when Yeager followed it down and fired a burst that severed the aircraft's tail. 4 victories in one mission. The second time, Yeager had achieved multiple kills in a single day. His total now stood at 11.5. The half was shared with another pilot who had fired at the same German bomber simultaneously. Both received credit for half a victory. It was the only time in Yeager's career that he shared a kill. He flew his final combat mission on January 15, 1945. By that point, the air war over Germany was winding down. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, running out of pilots, running out of aircraft. American fighters roamed German skies almost unopposed. Yeager's last mission was uneventful. No enemy contact, no combat. Just a routine patrol that ended with a routine landing. He had flown 64 combat missions. He had logged 270 hours of combat flying time. He had been credited with 11.5 confirmed victories, making him a double ace. He had been shot down once, evaded for 8 weeks, and returned to combat to become the first pilot in his group to make ace in a day. He had destroyed a German jet fighter. He had been awarded the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star for helping a wounded navigator escape across the Pyrenees, the Air Medal with 6 oak leaf clusters, and the Purple Heart. He was 22 years old. Yeager returned to the United States in February 1945. He married Glenys Dickhouse on February 26, 1945, at a ceremony in California. The woman whose name had been painted on every aircraft he flew became his wife. They would remain married for 45 years until her death from ovarian cancer in December 1990. After the wedding, Yeager reported to Wright Field in Ohio, uncertain about his future. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific was still ongoing, but Yeager was not sent to the Pacific Theater. Instead, he was assigned to test-fly repaired aircraft. It was routine work, safe work, the kind of assignment that kept pilots alive, but did not challenge them. Then someone noticed that Yeager, despite having only a high school education, could fly anything. He had an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that could not be taught. He could feel a stall developing through the seat of his pants seconds before the instruments showed it. He could land aircraft with damaged control surfaces by using throttle and trim. He could push aircraft to their limits without exceeding them. In 1946, Yeager was selected for test pilot training. The program required college-level mathematics and engineering knowledge. Yeager struggled with the academics. The equations made no sense to him. But when he got into an aircraft, he understood everything. He could feel what the equations were trying to describe. He became a test pilot not because he understood the theory, but because he understood the machines. In 1947, Yeager was chosen as the primary pilot for the Bell X-1 program. The X-1 was a rocket-powered aircraft designed to break the sound barrier. Many scientists believed it was impossible. They theorized that aircraft approaching the speed of sound would encounter shock waves that would tear them apart. Pilots who had approached Mach 1 in diving fighters reported violent buffeting and loss of control. The sound barrier was considered by many to be an actual barrier, a physical limit that could not be exceeded. Yeager disagreed, not based on theory, based on instinct. He had flown fast enough in combat to experience compressibility effects. He had felt the buffeting. He had watched his controls stiffen as he approached high speeds, but he had never felt the aircraft trying to kill him. He had felt it complaining. There was a difference. On October 14, 1947, Yeager flew the X-1 to Mach 1.06 at 43,000 feet over the Mojave Desert in California. He became the first person to break the sound barrier in controlled level flight. He did it with 2 cracked ribs. 2 nights before the flight, Yeager had gone horseback riding with Glenys. The horse threw him. He landed hard and cracked 2 ribs on his right side. He told no one except Glennis and the X-1 flight engineer, Jack Ridley. He knew that if the flight surgeon found out, he would be grounded. The X-1 program would be delayed for months while another pilot trained. The X-1 cockpit door latched from the inside, using a handle that had to be pulled with the right hand. Yeager's cracked ribs made it impossible for him to reach across his body with his right arm to close the door. On the morning of October 14th, Jack Ridley brought him a solution. A sawed-off broomstick approximately 9 inches long. Yeager held the broomstick in his left hand, used it to extend his reach, and latched the cockpit door. The man who had destroyed 5 German fighters in a single mission, 2 of them without firing a shot, broke the sound barrier using a piece of broomstick as a tool. The flight lasted 14 minutes. The X-1 was dropped from a B-29 bomber at 20,000 feet. Yeager ignited the rocket engine and climbed to 43,000 feet. The airspeed indicator showed Mach 0.96, Mach 0.98, Mach 1.0. The needle hit Mach 1.06 and stayed there. The aircraft did not shake apart. The controls did not lock. The shock waves did not destroy anything. The X-1 flew smoothly through the sound barrier as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Yeager later described the experience as anticlimactic. No drama, no violence, just a number on a gauge that said he had done something that supposedly could not be done. The achievement was classified for 8 months. The Air Force did not announce it publicly until June 1948. By then, Yeager had flown the X-1 dozens more times, routinely exceeding Mach 1 and exploring the flight envelope beyond the sound barrier. The man who had been told by scientists that breaking the sound barrier was impossible had turned it into routine test flying. Yeager's career continued for 28 more years. He flew combat missions in Vietnam, commanding the 405th Tactical Fighter Wing from Clark Air Base in the Philippines. He flew 127 missions in Southeast Asia. He commanded fighter squadrons in Germany, France, and Spain. He served as the first commandant of the Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, training the pilots who would later fly the space shuttle. He set speed records throughout the 1950s. On December 12, 1953, he flew a Bell X-1A to Mach 2.44, more than twice the speed of sound. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin at 75,000 feet. Yeager fought the controls for 51 seconds, while the X-1A tumbled toward the ground, spinning violently, its control surfaces ineffective in the thin air. He recovered at 25,000 feet, pulled out of the spin and landed safely. The incident would have killed most pilots. Yeager treated it as a data point. He retired from the Air Force on March 1, 1975, as a brigadier general. He had served 34 years. He had flown more than 180 different types of aircraft. He had logged more than 12,000 flight hours. He had been promoted to brigadier general in 1969, and later, in 2005, President George W. Bush promoted him to major general on the retired list. After retirement, Yeager remained active in aviation. He flew air shows. He consulted on aircraft design. He testified before Congress on aviation safety. He wrote 2 autobiographies. He became a spokesman for various products and causes. He never stopped flying. On October 14, 2012, Yeager celebrated the 65th anniversary of breaking the sound barrier by doing it again. He was 89 years old. He flew in the back seat of an F-15D Eagle that took off from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The pilot climbed to altitude and accelerated through Mach 1. Yeager, at 89, became the oldest person to break the sound barrier. Chuck Yeager died on December 7, 2020. He was 97 years old. He died in a Los Angeles hospital with family present. The cause was not publicly disclosed, but his health had been declining for several months. Among his personal effects, his family found his flight logbook from World War II. The leather-bound book contained entries for every combat mission he flew in the European theater. Each entry was written in small, neat handwriting. Aircraft type, mission number, time, duration, outcome, no extra words, no embellishment, just data. The entry for October 12, 1944 was typical. P-51D, mission number 42, Bremen escort, Glamorous Glen II, 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. Ammunition expended 587 rounds. Duration 3 hours 42 minutes. At some point after the war, Yeager had added a handwritten note at the bottom of that page. It was not standard logbook procedure to add commentary, but Yeager had done it anyway. The note read, 5 in 1 day, 2 without firing. Eisenhower was right. That was Chuck Yeager. No wasted words, no drama. Just the facts and a simple acknowledgement that sometimes the man making the decision knows better than the regulation telling him what he cannot do. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications, because next week we are covering another moment from World War II when someone broke the rules and saved lives because of it. Every single week we show you the stories that do not make the sanitized history books. The broomstick latch on the sound barrier flight, the evader who became an ace, the logbook entry that says more in 6 words than most memoirs say in 300 pages. Thank you for watching, and thank you for understanding that Chuck Yeager's story is not about being the best pilot. It is about being the right pilot in the right place, with the right combination of skill, vision, and stubborn refusal to accept that something cannot be done. Eisenhower could have followed the regulation and sent Yeager home. Yeager could have accepted that decision and finished the war in safety. Neither man did what was expected. Both men did what was necessary. Hit subscribe right now, then hit like so YouTube shows this to more people who need to understand that the greatest achievements in military history often came from decisions that violated the regulations. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what other World War II pilot you want us to cover next. Did your grandfather fly in the European theater? Did your family have a connection to the air war? We read every single comment. These stories belong to all of us, and we do not want a single one of them to disappear. Chuck Yeager did not quit over Germany. He did not quit when the regulations said he could not fly. He did not quit when scientists said the sound barrier could not be broken. We will not quit on bringing you these stories. We will see you in the next one.